before we start, could anyone in the chat please let me know if you can hear me and see me well? I will also open up a browser and just see, take a look at myself if the video and all audio qualities are fine. And also, could please anyone in the chat also let me know if you can hear me and see me well? Yeah, I think I can see myself, and hopefully someone will also confirm that they're able to hear me and see me well. Welcome to an online chess class. Today we're going to be speaking about the most fundamental, perhaps, part of chess. Everyone who has their own first class with any of the chess coaches, or if they go to any chess club, the first thing that anyone will teach them in strategy is going to be about the center. So today's topic is going to be the center. I can see people are joining. Welcome everyone. I assume that you can hear me and see me well. If you can, just confirm me in the chat. Before we go to the lesson, perhaps I should again shortly introduce myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Kestony, and for the last 8 years I'm a full-time chess coach. And today I'm very happy to present to you the first part of the fundamentals. All right, so everything is good. And I think we can then, without further ado, proceed with today's chess class. So since we're going to speak about the center, I'll have to explain you why do we need to control the center at all, why do we need pawns in the center if we need them at all, why do we need pieces in the center, and I'm going to show you quite a few games that I think that are going to boost your level quite a bit. It doesn't matter how high rated you are. I believe that the games are going to be instructional for any kind of rating, ranging from 0 to up to 2000, and I think that you all will enjoy the games as much as I did when I was preparing for this lesson. So first of all, why do we need the pieces in the center? Well, the pieces in the center are the most active. What does it mean? Well, it usually means that they control the most of squares. I set up this position. It's not a position that we're going to analyze a lot, but if you notice, maybe I can make the white pieces green and black pieces red. When white pieces are in the center, they control more squares. If you look at any piece, say compare the knight with the opponent's knight, white's knight is controlling 8 squares, and the black's knight there in the corner is only controlling 2. And same for queens and bishops, white's pieces are controlling more squares. And so that means that the pieces, if they're safe in the center, are the most effective there. I think that there are quite a few other games besides chess where controlling the center is very important, because that's the part from where you can easily get access to any part of the board. So now, since we know that the pieces are the most active and the most effective in the center, we may ask ourselves a question. And that question is this: why do we need the pawns in the center? Why don't we just develop the pieces to the center? So can anyone in the chat try to answer the question, why do we need to get the pawns to the center? For example, why cannot we just develop the pieces immediately? I know it's very basic, but let's start with the basics, and then gradually we'll increase the level of the questions and the examples. So there are quite a few answers. Someone is suggesting that we need to control the 4 squares. Others are saying that we may lose pieces early on. There are also some others are saying that there are openings where we just control the center with the pieces as well. So the classical way of looking at the center in general is that we need the pawns to support our pieces. So That's the most classical and the oldest approach. And there is this modern way of thinking about it. That's one of the also person's opinion in the chat, that we're able to control the center with the pieces. And sometimes we don't need the pawns to be there. For example, there is a grandfold defense and there are such openings. But before we understand that, we have to understand the classics, right? And if we look at the difference between, say, moves e4 and e3, let's just say we play e3. That controls also the center once, just like e4. However, this d4 square is not in the opponent's position. If we can divide the board into two parts, we can notice that the e3 pawn is not controlling the 5th rank or above. What does that mean for black? Well, let's just say black controls the center, and now white tries to remember the opening principles, and one of them saying that we need to control the center with the pieces and we need to develop. Now, if we're going to play knight f3, our knight can be chased away. So this pawn on e3 doesn't shield our own pieces from opponent's pawns. Same would happen if, say, we would play something like bishop to c4. And so right now our opponent can play d5 and kick our bishop again. So instead of developing the other pieces, now we have to move the same bishop again. And because black has this huge control of the center right now, he will comfortably develop the pieces to the best squares. So that's the old way of looking at it. And if we dive deeper, that's one of the reasons why everyone used to like the moves d4 and e4, and they loved those to the current day for white. Now, if we play e4, as you notice, because the queen is on d1, we can get d4 break quite easily because it's already protected. And so in a lot of openings, let's just say we play e5, knight to f3 attacking the pawn on e5, and now we have knight to c6. We get this break very, very early on. That's not the only way of playing the game. As you know, there is a Ruy Lopez and there is the Italian opening, but that's one of the main lines in this opening. That's called the Scotch game. And white is challenging the black center immediately. If we count the number of pawns we have over there, it's 2 versus 1, and say after takes and takes, white has more center, and ideally perhaps white should be able to get better bishops and knights, because they will that pawn will give protection for our pieces in the center where they're the most effective. So that's the classical way of looking at that. And so we can get this superior central control, which sometimes could also extend to space advantage if we put the pawn on e5 in many openings. So say this is the Scotch game. We could also look at ones like the Sicilian defense. White again would play knight f3, knight to c6, d4, bam bam. And so very fundamentally, if we don't take anything else into consideration, we could say white is controlling the center with the pawn, and thus ideally maybe he should get better bishops and knights, as the pawn will give us more protection from opponent's pawns, whereas our pawn could possibly in the future maybe march e5, we take away d5 and f5 squares, which potentially black would want to use for one of his pieces. Now, many years ago, perhaps people didn't like d4 as much for this reason, because after d5, the old king over here doesn't support a break e2 to e4. It's just hard to get it. And so people tried playing it with knight to c3, and black was so stubborn. They wanted to control the square and not allow white to get the move e4. And white usually tried to play this with bishop g5 and try to still achieve the e4 break, which would guarantee them more central control. If, say, black plays something like h6 or e6, then the life is beautiful. We could just take, for example, take and achieve that our dream break of e4, when white again could be saying that, hey, I have more pawns in the center, so I will have an easier life of developing the pieces to the center. Or at least that's how they thought it should be. And later black tried to defend the e4 square with the bishops, and if white would just casually develop, after a couple of moves, what we would find ourselves in, perhaps, is the position where black puts the pawn on c5, and then black would be able to place the pawn knight on c6, and already this combination of knight on c6 and the pawn on c5 looks better than the knight on c3 and the pawn on c2. So people stopped playing maybe d4 like 150 years ago, until one person discovered that we could also control the center with the move c4. So since we cannot get e4 very easily in this opening, people are just playing c4, and now we have 2 versus 1 pawns in the center. The first time black saw this, they were thinking, isn't that just a free pawn to take? Well, yes, but now white smiles, smile is from ear to ear, and white achieves their dream move e4. And so we're not only controlling the center, we're also attacking the pawn, and from the very fundamental perspective, we will be able to control the center with the pawns, and we are doing so, so we will get an easier development of bishops and knights, the most effective squares around the center. So that's the very oldest way of looking at the reason behind the pawns into the center. So let's jump to the third study of ours. I have to keep track of the numbers, and let's see what happens if one side is completely neglecting the center. Yeah, someone was saying Queen's Gambit accepted. That is right, that was the name for the previous opening. So here, white is going to play e4. This was a real game. Black plays the Sicilian defense c5. Now, the next move of white is very interesting. White plays the move b4. Why would they play b4? Can anyone in the chat try to give a reasoning or the compensation that white is looking to get after black takes on b4? Why white would be playing this gambit? Of course, this is not the best way of playing. In fact, with a perfect play, black gets an advantage, but there still must be an idea behind this move. So why would white be gambiting a pawn? Can someone in the chat help me? So there are a couple of answers. Let's wait for a couple more people to join. Very interesting. So the chat is saying everything perfectly. There are a couple of opinions, but I would just like to say that all of you were correct. I think that from the most important part that white is trying to achieve is undermine the black's central control. Right now, if we look at the board as it is, this pawn on d4, on c5 is controlling the d4 square, and thus it is controlling the center, preventing white from placing his pawns and pieces on the center, and so we're offering them our pawn that is not controlling the center. So after c takes b4, we will be able to now or later in the game get an easy d4, which guarantees us the central control, and we know already the benefits that come with it. Very effective pieces. And someone else was also suggesting very right thing, that we can develop now perhaps the dark square bishop or the knight with the tempo after move a3. It's also true that white perhaps could play bishop to b2 and develop a piece with a tempo, but usually after this move c takes b4, what white is playing is offering another pawn. And so this time, if black takes the pawn, we could take with either the knight or the bishop and start not only leading the central control, but also the development. And in this game, black will neglect the center at all with the pawns. So he's playing knight to c6. After this move, white took the pawn on b4 and black played knight f6. So the question is it the best way to control the center with the pieces this way? There are quite a few openings when we can control the center with the pieces and pawns are not enough. But that is not the case. Why? What white can do in this position? What is the problem for black? What would you guys play if you had the white pieces here? Don't worry if it's too easy. I promise you that I have prepared quite a few very hard classical games that even the most advanced players of you will enjoy. I always like to start with the basics though. So there are suggestions. b5, And you're absolutely right. What white can achieve in this position is chase away the black's knights. So because black has the control of the center and has an effective knights over there, white would love to kick them out, as black didn't have any pawns that shield the knights from white's pawns kicking them out. So b5, and now perhaps the black's knight only has a couple of squares that are good to choose from, but from both squares he will be chased away, whether it's d4 or e5. Well, in this case, black played knight to d4, and now white plays c3 and kicks the knight out. So knight to e6. Now white plays e5, and look what is happening with the black pieces. White is gaining superior control over the center. White-black has to just jump again and again with the knights. Knight to d5, by the way, this was a real game. c4. Again, white is putting another pawn that is controlling the center, this time in the opponent's camp with a tempo. Knight d to f4, g3, knight to g6, f4. And now white is simply threatening f5, and black seems to be actually losing a piece. So black in the game took on f4. This was an old game by very famous players, and black soon had to resign. Not a good day for black. So the first lesson is that if you try to put the pieces like that, like specifically knights, on the squares c6 and f6, be aware that they can be chased away by opponent's pawns. And that's one of the reasons why you need pawns in the center in the first place, if you're so ambitious with your piece deployment. Now we can jump to a little bit more advanced study, just a little bit more advanced, and I want to analyze this position without the bishops and the knights. So imagine that we have d3, d5, e3, and e5. And I would like to ask the audience, do you think that black is better in this position because of their central control? Seems like black is controlling the center. So is black better? I promise that there are no tactical tricks. Let's just poorly evaluate from strategic standpoint. So the question is black better in this position because of their central control? Probably there are going to be quite a few of opinions. You could also say that the position is equal. You might say that white is better. Or do you think that black is better or slightly better because of their central control? So there are quite a few opinions. Some people are saying that it is a draw. Some are saying that black is better. Now the correct evaluation is probably that the position is equal. Remember this, that the pawns in the center as well as space advantage is generally means 90, okay, 899 times out of 100, only benefits the minor pieces, which is bishops and knights. Now, do you think that these pieces of blacks benefit from the pawns d5, e5 more than the whites pieces from d3 and e3? And in fact, it is not true. If we said in the previous examples that pawns in the center allows us an easier deployment of our pieces where they're the most effective, which means around the center, and maintain them there, then in this position it is not true, because queen of whites can always be active. Queen is moving in so many ways that the pawns are never going to restrict her. In this position we could say play queen to g4 and attack the pawn. If say the pawn moves or black castles, we can play queen b4, and as you can see, white's queen will always find squares to be active. I would also like to say that the rooks are not benefiting from black's or white central control in any way. So it turns out if bishops and knights are not on the board, then here there is no difference to play a4, h4, d4, or e4. Central control does not matter. Again, in general, maybe there is an exception to this rule, but 9 times out of 10, and in this position as well. Here, at least if we play a4, we could say that we're lifting the rook, and rook could find activity via the third rank, right? So now you know that in every opening, when the position seems to be cramped, like for example, let's just put a position of the French defense, for example, advanced variation. We know that every minor piece exchange should benefit black as long as they're changing quite a few pieces. So if we were to take, say, the f1, g1, g8, and f8, okay, c8 minor pieces off the board, black perhaps might be completely equal. Although in this position with all 4 minor pieces, we would be saying that white has superior central control, or even you could say space advantage with the e5 pawn. And the space advantage is something that you will learn in the next stream from another CoChess coach. Also very interesting topic. You will see that is going to be very interesting as well. So now once you understand already these things, we can slowly start looking at the games. I still want to show you one more position before we're going to look at full games, where I'm going to give you full interesting exercises where I'm sure you will have a lot of fun with those. So I would like just to show you a couple of moves from the opening Queen's Gambit accepted, and white is going to play the e3 variation. The idea with the e3 variation is that white is easily and comfortably getting the pawn back on c4, and they're delaying e4 until they develop the pieces. So white is saying, for now, I just put the pawn on e3, I win back the c4 pawn, and then I will easily, say, get the e4 pawn to e4 when I will develop the other pieces that support it. Because, say, move e4 can run into e5, and it's not everyone's cup of tea. So we have e3, and our opponent, let's just say, plays knight f6, bishop takes c4, e6, knight f3. And we get a position where white has superior control over the center. I would say white would want to play e4, and in this position, if black was just to play passively, for example, let's make some passive moves. Bishop to e7, castle, knight c3, knight bd7, for instance, and e4. That just dead loss strategically for black. White has huge strategic advantage with the control of the center, just immense control of the center. That central control will then transpose into space advantage on the king side. Let's just say a couple more moves that are passive. e5, central control leads to space advantage, and now once we win in the center, we can continue with kingside attack for white. So you could imagine bishop d3, queen d2, queen e4, those kind of threats, or knight e4, knight g5, bishop is already looking there, rook lifts, deadly kingside attack in practice. So in order to avoid all this scenario, black cannot allow himself to play passively. And so what do you think would be the move for black to fight for that central control and not allow white an easy game? What should black be playing in this opening? Black for now seems to be lacking the central control, and we would love to equalize in that as black. And so, yes, you are absolutely right. The chat is very active today. Black must play the pawn move c5. So what black is hoping for is to undermine the white center. Imagine that if c5 and d4 pawns are exchanged, in theory, the central control is rather equal. Perhaps you could say that white side leads the development, and maybe bishop for now is controlling the center, but that's a very so-called dynamical advantage, just temporary. And so in this position, white usually castles, and black plays c takes d4. And here we're going to transition ourselves to another understanding element that we have to understand in chess. So the question is this, dear audience: how should white take the pawn? I can tell you that all 3 ways of capturing the pawn are possible, but if we open up the database of grandmasters, 95% of masters are capturing one way here. So you can guess what do grandmasters think, or 95% of them? What is the most precise way of capturing here to build up an advantage? How should white capture on d4? And I'm very glad that so many of you say the one thing, and I would proudly say that all of you are for now wrong. So only a couple of people said taking with the pawn, and if you set up this position in the Grandmaster database, 95% are taking with the pawn here, which is shocking news. Let me explain you why. Okay, so first of all, what happens if knight takes d4? It's true that white still has an advantage here, and there is nothing bad about that move. In fact, that's a good move as well. But now you have a temporary advantage. You temporarily read the development. And if you will not be able to convert this temporary development into an initiative, then black is soon going to develop all of their pieces, and you're going to find yourself in an equal position. So that is the problem, that if you won't be able to create threats in 5 or 6 moves, black can play moves like later, okay, bishop to d6, castle, knight c6, bishop d7, and the position will become equal. And so it's a lot harder to play with such a so-called dynamical advantage, which will just vanish very soon. And if you're not Magnus Carlsen, trust me, it's not going to be easy to develop the initiative over here. So what is the reason of why people are taking with the pawn here? Well, take a look. If we take with the pawn, we're claiming the central control. We're controlling it more. You could also call this half a space maybe advantage. To me, maybe it's more of a central control, but we're controlling those squares in the opponent's position. Look at how many of white's pieces are benefiting from the capture with the pawn. So if we're taking with the pawn, the light square bishop has been opened. Bravo to the dark square bishop. So here, if we take with the knight, it remains closed, and if we take with the pawn, it's opened. Let's take a look at the knight. Here, knight doesn't have any other outpost besides d4. If we take with the pawn, we have 2 outposts. Perhaps e5 is the most realistic one to get to, and it's deep in the opponent's position, where knight is going to influence the squares around the black's camp. So the knight is benefiting from that exchange as well. Now let's take at another piece. Take a look at the rook on e1. Now rook can enjoy the open e-file. So black's rook cannot come to the e-file, or at least it doesn't control there a lot of squares, because of course black's rook can come to e-file, but look at the white's rook activity over the e-file and the black's rook. Plus the black's light square bishop is closed in. And you might say that the pawn is weak, but it's weak in the endgame. In the middle game, white will be able to develop and deploy their pieces to more efficient squares. Because black is lacking that central control and space even perhaps, black will find very hard to both blockade the pawn and also attack it. For instance, if you ever establish the knight on d5, then you're no longer attacking the d4 pawn. Now, if you somehow try to remaneuver the bishop in the middle game to the f6 square, you might sleep on d5 when d5 is going to exchange that isolated pawn. So the static advantage that taking with the pawn gives you is superior central control, which transitions to more effective pieces or more effective deployment of the pieces, which will transition possibly to an initiative or a kingside attack. So d4 pawn is isolated because it's not protected, or it cannot be guarded by any other pawns in the near future. So I would like to show you a couple of games how such an advantage of isolated pawn, or just the pawn structure of the isolated pawn, I should say, could transition into an initiative and a kingside attack. So this is the first game. We're going to take a look at e4, c6, and Caro-Kann. And white plays d4, black plays d5, takes, and we have the so-called pan of variation of the Caro-Kann. So whenever black takes on c4 or white takes on d5, the d4 pawn is going to be an isolated, and we enter an isolated pawn structure. Of course, black doesn't want to usually take on c4 before the light square bishop is developed. So only after, say, we place bishop d3, black will take the pawn, and so then it counts that the light square bishop moved twice to capture on c4, which gets black an additional tempo. So we have a knight to f6 and knight to c3, e6, knight to f3, very common way of developing, bishop to e7, and here black takes on d5 and black takes with the knight, which gives white an isolated d4 pawn, which is a good thing to have when you're leading the development in the middle game, and a bad thing to have in the end game or when you're behind in development. So we have bishop to d3 this time. Perhaps if the bishop goes to d3, then white is more aimed at potential kingside attacks, whereas if we place the bishop onto c4 square, in the middle game, white would be more looking to develop the initiative with this d4, d5 pawn break. So we have castles, rook and knight to f6. At some point, white might be threatening to take on d5, and especially with rook e1 followed by bishop e4. So this would be just a prophylaxis move, knight f6, going back, and also the queen starts aiming at the pawn as well. So we have rook to e1, knight to c6, and a3. Now, I would like to ask you, why would white be playing a3 in this position, or in this structure at all? Why would white be playing a3 strategically? All the opinions are welcome. There are no good moves or bad moves or good opinions or bad opinions, just the opinion. So don't hesitate to just say what you think. I would like to also ask the audience if it's possible to put a like on this video. This means that what I am making is enjoyable for you and you're enjoying our lesson. Thank you so much for those likes. So there are quite a few opinions, and I have to say all of you are more or less right about the control over the b4 square. However, it's not only to restrict the bishop, the dark square bishop. In fact, in these type of positions, what black is aiming for is to get knight b4, knight d5. It's not only to hit the bishop, it's actually to control the d5 square. And if black manages to block the d4 pawn, then he can hope to somehow consider an attack against that. So if we just like randomly say play a move like h3 and black plays something like knight b4 with bishop knight to d5, in theory to follow, maybe this is not the most precise move order, then that in general should be something that black finds good. So for example, without the correct move order, bishop to b1 and knight to d5 and b6, bishop b7 to follow, in general should give at some point black a comfortable game where black is controlling the blockading square d5, and then we can hope to not only maintain a good piece in the center, but also perhaps to put some pressure on d4. And plus we're taking away one of the main plans of whites, which is to get rid of the isolated pawn with the break d5. Not only get rid of it, but a lot of the times also develop the initiative. So that's a prophylactic move, and usually if the bishop is on say c4 square, then this a3 move would be a reaction to place the bishop on a2, because a lot of the times knight a5 could hurt us, especially if we say play a move like d5. So quite an often move to be seen in the isolated pawn positions. Black played b6. Now we have bishop to c2. White is preparing a nice battery with the possibility of launching an attack against h7. So bishop g5, bishop f6, and a classical mate on h7 could follow. So bishop to b7, black always, or most of the time, tries to establish control over d5, so the bishop on b7 makes a lot of sense. We have queen d3 to follow, and black without waiting plays g6, which stops the Yes, so there are some questions in the chat. Don't hesitate, guys, to ask any kind of questions in the chat. That's why I'm there with you. Use me as your coach. And the idea, yes, when you're playing versus isolated pawn, is to stop it and blockade it, and then you have hopes of attacking it. Without the blockading of the isolated pawn, nothing will work of you. Perhaps the only other plan that Black has would be to enter an endgame. But in these positions, think about it. It's really very, very hard for Black to be exchanging pieces without changing the structure. Many think that, oh, I come to knight to d5, I take on c3, yay, I exchange the minor piece. But then you change the structure, and so it's no longer an isolated pawn. And if it's no longer an isolated pawn, the endgame is no longer good for Black. Same would happen after moves like knight e5. You take, I take with my pawn, and again the structure has been changed. So here we have bishop h6 attacking f8 rook, and you could already see the potential for White's kingside attack. With isolated pawn and this superior control of the center with the pawn in this case, White can build up the pieces for the correct attack, and we're taking our time. It's not that we have an isolated pawn and we have to rush, attack, attack, attack immediately, or else it will vanish. No, that central control is never gonna disappear unless Black, of course, undermines it. And Black is finding also hard to attack the pawn and blockade it. So we have rooks to c8, and now White thought that bishop has done enough already on this diagonal, so we're switching the bishop to b3. Watch this. Now even the a3 move suddenly is good, so that we could place the bishop on a2 in case Black plays knight a5. So what a multi-purpose move that was. And now from this diagonal, the bishop finally starts looking at the opponent's king again, and we have potential danger. Okay, I almost spoiled what things are going to happen. Don't want to say another purpose of the bishop there, but yes, we're aiming at the king, f7 and e6, and you will see what will follow very, very soon. So rook c7, Black played one slow move, and suddenly the game is over in practice, and in theory. So the thing is that in this position, if say White just plays king h1, nothing bad will happen to White. It's not like the White is like lost immediately. But if Black plays very slow move, like say rook c7, or maybe I should amend myself and should say imprecise move, Black could just be lost immediately. This rook c7 actually like makes sense from humans' perspective. We're overprotecting the 7th rank, like f7. Maybe the player thought to put the queen on 8 with more massive blockading, control over the blockading square and pressure along this diagonal. Maybe rooks could double on the d file, for example, with rook to d7. But White plays knight g5, and from this superior central control, now we have very, very aggressive pieces which will transition to initiative. So now Black played bishop f8 and offers an exchange of minor piece, getting closer to an endgame, he thinks. Well, one piece exchange is nothing bad to White. I think that the most important always bishop to keep is your good bishop, which is the light square bishop, the opposite color of the pawn in the center, and White exchanges that because what we get after that is a sacrifice. So now I would like you guys to think of possible sacrifices in this position, and to develop a very, very powerful initiative, and perhaps that will be the dagger, and White will win the game. So there are quite a few suggestions. There are rook e6, knight e6, and bishop takes e6. So I think that if we play knight e6, after pawn takes e6, bishop e6, king h8, I feel like White definitely has a compensation. Maybe that's also a way to play. Maybe we could say play a d5, but Black has a piece. And here, at least, I don't know if White has enough. It's very hard for me to judge. At least my eyeballs are telling that perhaps it could be not enough. No, bishop takes e6 followed by pawn takes e6 is already much more interesting to me. I feel like, again, after knight e6, maybe the game is just won. We followed that up with something like knight f8, and we could very well win the game. But what the grandmaster thought in this position and what he played was actually another move, maybe as good as bishop e6, maybe slightly better, is rook takes e6. So keeping that powerful bishop, because it will land some discovered chess if black was to take it. So imagine f takes c6, knight takes e6. What is happening? Here, here, here. Bishop is aiming at the king. Mamma mia, right? So after the queen moves, say queen b8, we now take on c7 with a check. And here white is just winning positionally, tactically. We have too much of an advantage here. So in the game, black played knight a5, hit the bishop. Again, a3 was such a brilliant move. We play bishop a2. And after knight h5, we have another sacrifice. And I would also like to give you an exercise here. So white to play and do another sacrifice. So a lot of you are right. It's the move that is rook g6 with the idea that they cannot take because queen g6, queen h7 is mate because the white's bishop is pinning the f7 pawn. And so queen h7 will follow, and there is nothing that black can do to avoid the mate in this game. So rook g6, black played knight g7, and rook f6 with huge advantage for white. Black just resigned. I'm pretty sure that there is mate. On the next moves, black is down in material, and look at the white's pieces, right? There's nothing they can do. All right. So now I'd like to show you another very interesting game. We're also going to see how an advantage in the opening where white has the center and tries to fight for the center can lead to a very, very strong initiative and a kingside attack. So here we're going to see a game. Let me make sure I get the names right. It's Reshevsky versus Averbakh. Two classical players, two legends, two stars. So we have d4, knight f6, c4 by white, controlling the center, e6. So the so-called Nimzovich opening if white goes with knight c3, and black pins the knight with the bishop. So what's the idea of this move? Perhaps the idea is not only to double the pawns. For example, if after a3 black seems to be giving up their good bishop and white has two bishops, but one of the things that black gets is that white has a doubled pawns. c4 could be a target that we could potentially attack. Maybe if everything goes well and very slow, a way of attacking that would be something like bishop a6, knight c6, knight a5, and maybe even queen c8, queen b7, queen c6. Again, far from reality, but it is a target that black could attack. And also black gets the so-called light square. So you could imagine that after b6 and bishop b7, all this diagonal is to himself, and if black manages to control the e4 square well and not allow white e4, those squares in the center, the e4 square, will suffer. And usually if white plays anything related to f3, black responds with d5 to take control over e4. So that's the most fundamental part behind this fight for the center with this setup as black. White goes for the classical line, and if white doesn't play e3, black usually doesn't take, because they're waiting for us to waste a tempo on that, and we're not. So castles, and now we play knight e2. Or not, should I say not us, but Reshevsky played knight e2. And the idea is simple. We want to play a3, and after bishop takes c3, now there is no one stopping us from taking with the knight, and then bishop takes c3. It doesn't make any sense at all. On the other hand, knight could be a little bit misplaced over here, and that's a drawback, but knight should come to f4 or g3 a bit later in the game. So now black thinks, okay, time to to fight for the center, let's play d5, let's get e4, c4 under our control or influence as well. And now a3. Bishop drops back. There is no point in taking here anymore because black doesn't get either the light squares or the doubled pawns for white. So we have bishop to e7, and now c d5, pawn takes d5, and knight g3. So very interesting situation. Why would white be going for knight to g3? What's the idea behind it? There is a question in the chat. Thank you for the question. How to decide if the bishop is good or bad? Well, the good bishop or the useful bishop is usually the ones that guards our weaknesses. Those are the squares that cannot be protected by our pawns. So, or they would, protecting them would cause us problems. So for white, the weak squares for now at least are c4, e4, because black does control them with the pawns and we don't, and so our light square bishop would be the good one. For black is the opposite. You look at the pawn on d5, so the opposite color of the pawns in the center are the stuck pawns. That's the bishop that is good. So if the pawns on the light squares, then the dark square bishop is the good one because the pawns are already controlling the light squares and dark squares are not undercover. So that's the most fundamental way of describing perhaps which bishop is good or bad. So here in this position, what black had to do is fight immediately for the center himself. White plays knight g3, and his plan is going to be playing bishop d3, f3, and now e4, and get that very mobile superiority in the center when we can transition into space advantage and the initiative with a possible even kingside attack. So the way that black should have played this is with c5. So if black strikes in the center right now, takes and bishop takes, both players have reasonable control over the center, and position seems to be balanced. And as we learned from the previous examples, the fact that black has an isolated pawn don't bother him in the middle game, as he is not behind in development. And also, because the white's knight is on g3, we know that it won't help to block the d4 square. If it was on f3, it could block it more well. And so that will make black's life a lot easier to get d4. So for example, you could say bishop d3, knight c6, castles, and d4 would follow very, very quickly. So this position would be something that black would find pretty comfortable, I'm sure, to play. But in the game, Averbakh played bishop to e6. Yes, that is true. If you have pawns in the center and the light squares, then the light square bishop is bad. And white plays bishop d3 again in the center, and all to control this e4 square. Knight bd7, castle, c6, just normal development. Bishop goes to d2, rook e8, queen c2, and seems like black did also everything well. White's plan is very clear if you look at it. White is just piling up for everything for f3, e4. That's all he wants, superior control of the center and the initiative that we're going to develop afterwards. And what black should be looking for here, perhaps, again, would be to play c5. It's, again, preferred to fight for that center squares, and if d takes c6 would happen, then knight takes c5 is even coming with the tempo, because you don't want to give up the light square bishop. So here, again, pretty balanced position. I believe black should be very comfortable here as well. But in the game, Averbakh does not fight for the center. He played a5. So now we have knight to c to e2, and slowly perhaps we're maneuvering our pieces to the king side. Knight b6, knight to f4 hitting the light square bishop, bishop to d7, rook f to e1, bishop f8. Black is trying to control the e4 square as well, very well, to stop him from achieving e4 break, f3, e4, and white tries to get superior control there. So f3, bishop to c8. So bishop c8 prevents e4 in a way that d4 drops. So white is unable to play the e4 pawn break, because say we play e4, and after taking, the d4 pawn will drop. So that's the purpose of bishop c8, opening up the queen on the d file. White finishes the development with rook a c1, g6, perhaps black is looking to activate the bishop a little bit more with fianchettoing it, and here the bishop will look more in the center, e5, d4 squares, knight back to e2, bishop g7, and white is just preparing e4. Now, even a prophylactic move like h3 is nice, so that after we play e4 and change the structure into that black wouldn't have dreams of any knight g4 or bishop g4s. So black plays a4, and now what is the move for white? So the question is this: why so much concentration on e4? Because if we allow the pawn move to e4, we will achieve a central superiority. We will gain superiority in the center, which we learned in the previous examples will lead to more effective pieces, and more effective pieces will lead to initiative, which leads to an attack, which leads to winning the game. What about this transitioning? So that's how I like to explain the central control and why would you need to achieve that. It's because of the effectivity of the pieces there that lead to winning games and tactics. Does that make sense, Ankit? Please keep the questions coming. Use me as your coach. I will gladly answer them all. Those who have just joined, I would be thankful to if you put on a like on the video. That means what I do here makes sense, and that you enjoyed the stream and the lesson. And yes, many people are saying it's time to play e4. We get this superiority, and the central control could even transpose to the space advantage, a topic that another coach will cover in a couple of days. I'm sure that that's going to be another very interesting stream and lesson for you. And here, a lot of the times when white gets this space advantage with e5, we chase away the black's pieces away from that part, which is the king side now, which means we get even more squares that are effective for our pieces, and that leads to an attack again. So here black decided to take, and at least black in this position has hopes to attack the white center. So there are positions where white has the center, and for example Grunfeld is one of the openings, and black is completely fine. So if black found himself to be able to attack this center very, very well, or imagine after bishop e6 that we would play something like e5. Seems like space advantage, right? Bad idea. Now we can play knight f to d7 as black. We gave up the d5 square. c5 will undermine the white center, and now once our pawns are gonna be well, away from each other, because after c5 black is threatening to take on d4, it's going to be very, very hard for white to hold on to these pawns. Just look at the pressure that black will be building. So say we get c5, imagine here on e5, two pieces immediately, the rook would be open, d4 is also going to be undermined. So that would be a mistake, and I don't think that that's a good move to make. So don't over push, but as long as the pawns are controlling these squares like they are right now, right? Black's pieces cannot go to effective squares. We always have potential to move forward if that is feasible, and that is good for us. And all of our pieces could be around on the most effective squares. Now we can use, say, the F file, for example, and you will see how white's pieces will get the superiority. So first they play bishop e3. By the way, that's what I say black wants to take on e4, because bishop e6, e5, where is black's counterplay? Now it's a lot harder to undermine those pawns, because, or at least attack them, because the d file is closed. Of course, that plan perhaps with c5 still exists, but I believe with the open file it's much better, and I understand why Averbakh decided to take. So how do you understand when you have an initiative? Initiative is creating threats. So the initiative is when I can move my pieces to active squares, or just make them active while creating threats, or just an attack. That's why I call an initiative. So if I move to good squares and my opponent has to react by defending or putting pieces to passive squares, that is initiative. And can you explain the central control over the isolated pawn? So if you look back in the video, this video will be able available on YouTube, and you can go back. I explained it very well early on, maybe like after 15 minutes in the game, but I could just mention that from isolated pawn, we're controlling the squares in the opponent's position. And if you notice, our bishop, rook, and knight, as I mentioned a lot of times, have bishop has the open diagonal compared to the black's bishop, white has an open file, and white also has, if it's white's pawn on d4, e5, c5 outpost for the knight. So that's to answer your question very shortly, but you will find a comprehensive answer earlier in the game, in the video, around 20-30 minutes back, I believe. Thanks for the question, guys. So bishop to e3, white is just guarding the d4 square here, because black is, well, indirectly applying pressure on it, as you can see. So bishop to b3, queen to d2, white can in the future exchange the most loyal guard of the black's king side, as the dark squares are weakened. Knight f to d7, and now bishop to g5. So a very, very provocative move, and it's very hard to say what to do here with black. So if bishop f6, I don't know if we want to exchange that. That's the most loyal guard of our king, and who is going to cover the dark squares around it. Queen is not exactly perhaps the most ideal piece to guard those dark squares. It's better than nothing, of course, and I believe that that's the way to play as well. But in the game, black played f6, and I'm not the biggest fan of this move, and the point of bishop g5 was this particular provocation. After f6 pawn moved, it's not necessarily to make the dark square bishop of opponents passive, but to just make the pawns around the king move, and as they move, they're leaving weaknesses behind it. So if you look at the pawn structure right as it is now, the g6 pawn lost some protection, and after we move, say h4, h5, take, that pawn is already hanging. If we do it before, imagine we play h4, h5 takes, black would be taking with f or h pawn, and the only way you can break that is if you say sack. So that's a lot more solid. So after bishop to g5, black plays f6, white goes back bishop e3, and he's happy with this provocation. So now black played knight f8, a bit passive, but remaneuvering the knight to very efficient e6 square, where again black is hoping to put pressure on the white center. And that's the idea. That's why black is not like dead lost or complete lost. It's a very mobile center for white, one of the many centers that are described in the chess literature. But black has counterplay as long as we can put pressure on those pawns, or if, say, somehow these pawns get stuck. So if we say play e5, like imagine this kind of structure, and black has huge control over these squares with potential break of c5, and they're well blockaded. That's where things could go potentially wrong for white as well. So here white just goes for this plan of h4. It's possible, of course, to play h5, but it's always suspicious to see how we move our kingside pawns with a vulnerable king, because white's pieces are clearly aiming at that, and I don't think we should be touching all the pawns with black. So maybe that's the reason why black plays bishop f7, seems to be stopping h5, or at least they thought so. White plays h5 anyway. So the point is that after g takes h5, we just have a deadly kingside attack, knight f5 followed by bishop h6, and all of white's pieces are coming near the king, you could imagine. Queen could come later to h6 after the dark square bishop of white's is exchanged. Rook f1, the next knight is coming, and that's not what black wanted to be in. So in the game, they just played knight e6, again putting pressure on the white center. White plays rook f1 to cover the file, and we're slowly transitioning from that superior central control, which leads to superior pieces, to a flank attack. Once we have solved problems in the center and we're superior there, we can attack on the side. Because as you know, as you're attacking, as one of your opponents is controlling the center, it's very rare that the attack on the flank will work. In fact, one of the most common rules that we teach as chess coaches is that when one player is attacking on the king side, the counter attack is in the center, because right from the opening stage we try to make all of our pieces go there. And if we obtain the control over that center, that means effective pieces, and that means better counterplay than on the wing. But if we already achieve central superiority, we should maybe follow that up with a flank attack. So white just plays rook f2, knight d7, lots of maneuvering, rook c f1, and just preparing a kingside attack. And now at last black plays c5. We said that he should be playing that on move 10 or 15, right? Now white plays d5, gets a pass pawn. And again, as I said, like, if well blockaded, in some scenarios it could be fine, but now I don't think they're well blockaded, and white has the superior center, and white is just enjoying himself on the king side. So rook to f4. Now white has such a huge compensation. White has such a huge compensation for lacking the control of the e5 square that it's just not enough for black to say that, hey, I have the knight on e5 and I'm going to be enough to say that the f file and the central control of whites and the pieces that are coming to the king side are not enough. Rook f4 and now rook to h4 with a deadly kingside attack, and white just closes his eyes about the e5 square. It doesn't matter, just one element compared to this gigantic amount of advantage that white has from the piece activity center and the coordination of the pieces and the vulnerability of the black's king, perhaps. So black of course tries something, b5, rook h4, knight e5, and here was the time where Reshevsky played a slow move. We had to play bishop h6 and follow that up with a very active move. Reshevsky, I think he was low on time, at least that's what the history says, and he played king h1. And here black had an opportunity to create counterplay. So believe it or not, in this position black can survive. We can play knight takes d3, exchange the bishop of white, and play f5, striking in the center with the tempo. So now h4 rook is hanging, and as we move, now it's already getting very complicated, right? So black can even go for knight takes d5 sacrifice. Well, it looks like a sacrifice, right? And after e takes d5, look at the white's counterattack, right? Already black seems to be having compensation and perhaps even developing the initiative. And I'm sorry, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5. And here black seems to be down a piece, but white's kingside attack falls apart because queens are exchanged. And here already we have an interesting endgame that black maybe could survive. At least I don't know who to even choose. Maybe would even choose black. At the same time, we can see that also there is an attack against the bishop, so small initiative here and there. But in the game, white played queen to d7, and that was perhaps enough for white to be developing all that he wanted, and we have rook takes f6 here. And the point is this, that if you don't find yourself in counterattacking the white center in time here as black, and you're not able to not allow the white's pieces to go to the king side, then you're just waiting for the white to come and get you. So this is a beautiful example how white's superiority of the center after f3 and e4 transitioned into space advantage when we put the pawns to restrict the opponent's pieces in his camp, and the pieces that are very active behind it to very nice initiative. So imagine rook could be lifted, f6, h4, we had the f file, the bishop is always looking to get to h6, and even that pawn, the bishop on d3, actually plays a major role of guarding e4, and if at any moment we could play e5, although that seems to be impossible, bishop would be started to playing again. So we have knight g4, and now just bishop g5 with a dead attack. So after knight f6, there is no chance of surviving that. You could imagine that bishop g7, desperate try to attack would just lead to dead dark squares along this diagonal, right? It's just not the way to play. So in the game, black played bishop g7, and now rook f4 followed, knight e5, and white is just enjoying himself, slowly exchanging the main defenders of the black's king and bringing more and more and more pieces to the king side. So bishop f6, rook f6, and if I just were to look at this position, and I would see some of my students were playing that, my evaluation is that my student, if he was white, is completely winning the game. Black's king is just weak. That's the most important king element in chess, although white's king is also open, but just look at the white's pieces around black's pieces around white's king, and white's pieces around the black's king. There is a huge difference. So now we had king g7, and all the pieces are coming, and knight f5, again, due to the pin, we can do this move, and queen has to be given up, and black lost the game. So this is the most perhaps fundamental lesson on the center. Of course, to cover it all, we would need more lessons, but I believe that I explained well why do we need the pawns in the center, and in general control of the center. If you're able to control the center with the pieces and your pieces are not chased away, that is fine. We learned that there are openings where we could apply the pressure on the opponent's center and have a huge compensation for that. And we also saw a couple of games how the isolated pawn can lead to more central control, which leads to better pieces, and that leads to initiative and a deadly attack. And in this game, again, I think we saw how white got superior central control that led to a beautiful kingside attack. So dear audience, I hope you enjoyed the lesson a lot. Thank you all for watching. If you can, put a like on this video. That means a lot to me. I'm going to see you again in the future lessons more and more time. Looking forward to seeing other coach lesson on the space. That is going to be a very good transitioning lessons from today's topic. So I'm looking myself forward to that. I'm going to be perhaps one of the spectators in the audience. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time. Be safe, have a nice day, love the game, and continue playing chess.